Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salamullahi alaikum. We're going to begin today's session, the fourth in this series of Al-Andalus from Rise to Fall. What we'll be taking a look at today, three themes which we'll break down and I'll explain them shortly. The themes are a governance of greed. The second, a caliphate in crisis. And the third, a need for a miracle. The objectives in more detail at what we'll be looking at is we'll go over where we left off in last session about the battle of Balāṭ ash-Shuhadā and the tragedy that was, but some hope which emerges after that. This person in history known as Uqba ibn al-Hajjaj. Then we'll start to see the second part. If you remember, we spoke about the governance, the era of governance in Al-Andalus, which follows the era of conquest, really has two parts to it. The first was that of success and glory, and the second is a governance of greed. And we'll take a look at how that then leads to things like discrimination, corruption, decadence, fitan, fasad, spreading through this peninsula. We'll look at also the rise of the Khawarij and who were the Khawarij and why they play an important role in, when I say important, I mean albeit negative, but it still remains a significant role in the downturn of Muslim governance in Al-Andalus. Then we'll also look at a caliphate being crushed in the east. And we're speaking of the Umayyad Caliphate, the caliphate which took place after the Khulafa al-Rashidun, beginning with the great and legendary Sahabi radiallahu an Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, and from his offsprings thereon you have the Umayyad Dynasty or the Umayyad Caliphate, and how it was the only caliphate to actually have central authority over the entire Muslim world. After this caliphate disappears, centralized or absolute centralized authority never actually re-emerges in the Muslim world till date. So this loss, we'll kind of speak a bit about that. We'll then speak about this personality known as Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah. Who was he? His struggle to survive. We'll return to Al-Andalus and look at this chaotic atmosphere which is there, but why this atmosphere all of us appears to be conducive or suitable for Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah's own personal struggle. We'll take a look at Abdul Rahman's arrival on the peninsula, and then a battle which follows on known as Al-Musara, and perhaps lessons to be learnt from this entire thing. So with that in mind, let us return to where we were, the Battle of Poitiers, or Balāṭ ash-Shuhadā, which we'd kind of covered, and we're actually reminded that of the words of Allah, وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامِ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ, and those days we shall rotate them amongst the people. We know that Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, who we spoke of in the last session, he was he was a great leader, somebody with passion, somebody with zeal, somebody with the right intentions. He takes an army of unprecedented numbers forth to meet King Charles Martel. And yes, although King Charles had heavily outnumbered the Muslim army with an army almost 400,000 strong, yet numbers were not ever the key issue in Muslim tragedies. It was always other factors. And in this case, once again, we're reminded almost of the Battle of Uhud in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, where the spoils of war, or the treasures which the Muslim armies had kind of accrued whilst they were going from town to town and city to city and conquest to conquest, these are endangered, and the Muslim armies turn back for their spoils of war, which eventually leads to the downfall of the entire battle. Now, such loss, and thousands of people, and there's thousands of people who suffer and meet their fate at that battle from the Muslim armies, and then the Muslims are chased away back into the Iberian Peninsula, away from southern France, and huge parts of southern France are reconquered. That's where we had kind of left this. This tragedy, you see, we are taught never to despair. Allah teaches us that not to وَلَا تَقْنَطُوا, and do not despair. So, what are some of the lessons or the opportunities that we see the Muslims find in these difficulties? Well, first of all, the Muslims, their existence was not exterminated from the Iberian Peninsula, although southern France, huge territory was lost, huge losses Muslims faced, but King Charles' armies did not chase the Muslims down into what would be modern-day Spain. They kind of left them after the Pyrenees mountain. They kind of just let them be. This was a huge opportunity, because think about it. If they had decided to continue chasing the Muslims south, Allahu A'lam what could have become of the Muslim civilization there. So it was an opportunity, and then we see a person rise from this cloud of confusion, who becomes the next governor. And this is really still part of the first era of governance, the first part. His name was Uqba ibn Hajjaj as-Saluli, and he's given this chance to become a governor. And he was actually given a choice by the Caliph, that would you like to be in charge of the whole North African terrain, huge territory, Muslim territory, huge, gigantic, or would you like to be the governor of Al-Andalus? We think about it, there's recent loss, recent tragedy, morale is low. Would you like to go there? And he's actually given that choice, and he decides to go to Al-Andalus. Allahu Akbar. And this is how people are. You see, when they see misfortune, when they see tragedy, as opposed to just falling back, stepping aside, letting things go, they rose to the challenge. Because this is an attempt, this is a possibility to do something which will count significantly. And he does exactly that. Uqba ibn al-Hajjaj as-Saluli arrives on the peninsula. He sets forth, he tries to correct the morale. He leads, he once again assembles certain armies. He heads north again. He goes into French territory once again, where many of the Muslim armies had been, or where there were areas of confusion. He actually stabilizes a certain amount. He goes in. They say where he loses, for example, suffers losses and loses territory, he returns and returns. They said up to 7 times almost he went back into what was seen as lost territory, and secured huge parts of that for the Muslim civilization which was in Al-Andalus. And he adds that, and this is how we are seeing once again, tilka al-ayyam, those days being rotated. So there is success, there is loss, there is tragedy, but there is once again a sense of rejoicing, a sense of success. Now, he does that, and he manages to secure a certain amount of not only victory, but also restore some of the morale that the Muslims were kind of suffering from. And he does that, and he rules successfully for for the following few years. But then unfortunately he meets his loss at I believe it was a village known, or a town known as Qarquna, I believe they called it. But he's actually, he himself is martyred in that particular town, fighting against some of the Christian armies, and I believe they were mainly kind of designated by King Charles Martel. So this is taking place, and now he falls to his fate as well. But what follows from here is a huge turn in Muslim history. You see, what we saw was there was a wound, and people were attempting to patch up that wound. There was a gap, and people were trying to fill it in. But what follows, subhanallah, you see, after Uqba ibn Hajjaj as-Saluli, the next governor that comes in, his name is Abdul Malik ibn Qatan al-Fihri. Now this guy, he doesn't really give a damn about many of the things that were going on. He rises, he sees in Al-Andalus there is quite a lot of wealth that the Muslims have gathered. He starts to not only enjoy the wealth, consume the wealth, he starts to look out. He was somebody that the historians write was extremely muta'assib, very tribalistic, very racist and discriminating against other tribes and races. He didn't care. He begins with, initially, as he starts to rise to power, in alienating the Berbers, who had played a significant role in the Andalusian conquest. He starts by saying, well, these people ain't even Arabs. Why are we giving these people this type of... He starts to do things like, where there were little conquests, he starts to refuse to give them the spoils of war, or their rewards, or whatever it was that they were entitled to. Now this, as you can imagine, leads to huge, once again, anti-authoritarian sentiments amongst the people, huge type of, I'm not just talking about quarrels and disputes, I'm talking about civil type of strife taking place. Huge, like you can imagine these type of things. But he doesn't stop there. He's also looking at things like, certain tribes within the Arabs, not just like, let's discriminate against the Berbers. He's saying, these Arabs, they've come from Sham, and these Arabs, they've come from Yemen, and these people are part of my tribe. Those people ain't part of my tribe. What are they doing in this position of power? So he starts to turn against them. So now it's Arabs versus Arabs, tribes versus tribes. The Adnaniyin are arguing with the Qahtaniyin. Whilst all of this is happening, we start to see, because people, you see, once people begin to get upset with the status quo, especially the political status quo, some people, obviously many people will turn to religion, but some people began to turn to what was a very rare, but yet also extremely dangerous strand of Muslim society or of Islamic theology, which is the Khawarij. Now, for those of us who are unaware, the Khawarij were a people that arose, or a group that emerged during the time of Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu an and Muawiyah. And they were people who actually declared Sayyidina Ali radiallahu an and Sayyidina Muawiyah radiallahu an and all these companions to be kuffar, to be disbelievers. They were people who would say anybody who commits a major sin is a kafir, and we got nothing to do with these people. They would declare the rulers to be kuffar. They would say that you have to fight and take over, and they would spread and aid this type of vigilante rule. If you, anybody who studied Islamic history is aware that when they managed to get a stronghold in Basra, in Iraq, and the damage they did there, and the men and women and children they massacred, is well documented, to the extent that it's narrated how they would kill pregnant women and so on, and use verses of the Quran to justify, and they would actually drag out the fetus from within, and so on, and all these stories are there. But the Khawarij were an extreme minority, but they were an extremely dangerous kind of cancer that existed within the Muslim society. Now this began to emerge in Al-Andalus. And the reason it started to emerge in Al-Andalus is actually to do with North Africa. And that's because originally some of the Khawarij had escaped to North Africa and started to take over and we'll come back to that in a moment. But some of these ideas then started to filter across into Al-Andalus. Now in Al-Andalus, many people had huge issues with the government, and many people were victims, especially the Berbers. So the Berbers started to find some solace amongst the Khawarij type of ideology. So many of the Berber at the time began to embrace this ideology almost as a reaction against the authorities and against the government. Meanwhile, in southern France, King Charles Martel drives his armies further south and crushes many of what was remaining of small Muslim settlements and civilization that was there. He kind of drives them completely out and crushes those settlements which were to be found. This is the type of stuff that's going on. Now, the governance era, part 2, or the governance of greed, has begun. We can see that this daylight seems to be disappearing. The sun is, it seems as though, is beginning to set. Now we have to kind of take a step back. We have to zoom out all of a sudden. I want us to zoom out of the Iberian Peninsula. We've got the entire globe in front of us now. And we're going to zoom back into the Middle East. The Middle East, if you remember, was where the Umayyad Dynasty, the Muslim Caliph, would live, and the Caliphate was established. It was in Damascus in Syria. That's where we've zoomed into. The Caliphate is in crisis. Many people throughout the Muslim world are kind of not happy with some of the things going on. There's different movements taking place, which they're trying to deal with. Unfortunately, the Khawarij, which I'd spoken of, many of them had kind of escaped and gone to North Africa and began to raise an army amongst themselves and attack certain cities after cities. And they were actually becoming successful in their military campaign. So they were taking over small towns first and villages, and then attacking cities, and then obviously they'd get more type of artillery and military type of strength, and then move on to the next city and get more people, and people obviously were unhappy. Some people were unhappy with the Umayyad rule. Some people were saying, oh, the Umayyads are, they're not taking care of us, they're just spending on the Middle East, and they're not doing this and they're not doing that. So they were happy to kind of join or to aid the Khawarij, and many people were kind of just turning to the Khawarij movement. So this is the type of stuff that's going on. Now they are in, what are the Umayyads doing themselves? Now if you remember, many of them, you would think that is this a time when you would try and address these issues, but one of the largest or most successful Umayyad Caliph had died. His name was Hisham. And the ones who came after him, Walid and so on, they didn't seem to be tackling these destructive elements of Muslim society. They weren't dealing with it. They weren't going about trying to deal with this type of fractionism, or with people being discontent with them, or not spending money. And they were just concerned and preoccupied with their own household issues, with their own family affairs, with their personal lives, with their own type of arguments and disputes that were taking place. This was the type of stuff that was going on. Allahu Akbar. This is where, if you remember, where one of the persons had addressed them, a poet of the time, with that poem, where he had said that I see a fire that is going on, and if you remember, we went over that, he said, فَإِن لَمْ يُطْفِهَا أُقَلَاءُ قَوْمِ, that if the intelligent people of my, the geniuses or the intelligent people of the ummah of my people do not put out this fire. And he had said that I fear in yakuna waquduha juthathun wihamu, that I fear that its fuel will be corpses upon corpses. And he said, فَقُلْتُ مِنَ التَّعَجُّبِ لَيْتَ شِعْرِ. He said that I say out of amazement that, whoa, that, oh my God, like that. And he said, أَأَيْقَاذٌ أُمَيَّةُ أَمْ نِيَامُ, that are Bani Umayyah asleep, or are they awake? Do they know what's actually happening, what's slipping from their hands? And unfortunately, whether it appears, history teaches us that they seem to be more asleep than awake, and more concerned about their personal affairs at that time. And what happens in this type of state of confusion is a powerful movement rises, and it comes from the Far East, from Khurasan and so on. And this is something which is very amazing and interesting, but we can't go into it in too much detail. But perhaps another day, another time, that will be an interesting course in itself, how the Umayyads and the Abbasids kind of rose to power and so on, and the type of interplay that took place between them. But this movement of the Abbasids comes from the Far East, and it sweeps the Muslim world, especially the Middle East. It sweeps them. And not only does it kind of have a staggering victory in taking over, what they do is they begin an onslaught of any Umayyad threat that they can find. So any prince or any person who belonged to the Umayyads household, any man, any male who was of any potential threat, as in he was, at least he wasn't a child, so anybody that was, even if he was a teenager or something like this, that's it, they would eliminate him. And this is what they were doing. They were going from street to street, from house to house. They were digging out every Umayyad that they could get hold of and just slaughtering him. In fact, you see the rise of one of the, and you can read up on him, he took on the title actually, as-Safah, which means the one who kind of sheds so much blood. And they say in one day when he went to Damascus, Allahu A'lam, but people say up to 30,000, 40,000, but thousands and thousands of people massacred in one day. Allahu A'lam how much exaggeration there is, but there was huge loss. And this is what is going on. Meanwhile, the Khawarij movement, which is taking place in North Africa, they actually begin to consolidate what they have. Most of North Africa is at this stage now under Khawarij control. The person in charge goes by the name of Abdul Rahman ibn Habib al-Fihri as well. He's from this tribe, this Yemeni tribe, al-Fihri. Now, North Africa is subdued by the Khawarij, except one simple, just the town of Sabta, and we did speak of Sabta once before, when we spoke about the conquest and King Julian, but Sabta remains unconquered by the Khawarij. Everything else is under their control. The Middle East and the entire Muslim part of the world in that region is now under Abbasid control. So the thing, what we find is, with all this going on, Andalus has its own little problems, which we're going to return to shortly. But the reason I've brought all of this up is to show you that when all this confusion is going on and all this bloodshed and there's a brutal change of power that is taking place, and Umayyads are running for their lives and they're hunted down and being killed one by one, and the Khawarij have broken away and now are ruling North Africa. Andalus has almost completely come off the agenda in terms of priorities. The Muslim world and the authority in the East isn't even concerned with what's going on in Al-Andalus. So with that in mind, what we do is we're going to have to zoom out of the Middle East and come straight back to the Iberian Peninsula. We've had governor following governor, greed upon greed, corruption, decadence, debauchery, people consuming wealth for themselves, giving allotments just to family members, tribalism, discrimination, people being attacked because of their race, many rebellions taking place. And then you have one of the final governor who kind of rises. His name is Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman, and once again he's from this tribe, Al-Fihri, and he rules for 8 years, and he's the final of the governors, and he absolutely does not care. I mean, he tries to suppress some of the rebellions for his own personal gain, but one of the things he does as soon as he comes into power, he realizes, oh, what's going on in the East, there's all this type of turbulence and there's all this going on and people are upset and discontent with the Umayyads, and he realizes there's a struggle going on in North Africa, and the Khawarij seem to be taking over. He says, right, we are absolutely independent. We no longer, because if you remember, this was the era of governance where the governors were directly beneath the Caliph. He says, we no longer are beneath Bani Umayyah. So what are we? He says we are an imara. We are a separate kingdom. And we don't need to be under any caliph or anything. We've just got our own rule. We are a separate continent and we are a separate kingdom. So that's what he does. He declares himself just an Amir. He doesn't say he's a Khalif or anything like this, but what he does is he calls himself the Amir, and he says this isn't a Khilafah, but this is an Imara. So this is a kingdom and I am ruling it. That's what I'm doing. Meanwhile, the rebellions rise from over 10 to almost 20 different rebellions going on throughout the country. And I don't just mean small scale, large scale. On large scales, King Charles Martel crushes whatever was remaining of the final Muslim settlements in France and completely eliminates almost any trace of Islam from French territory. If you remember, I spoke earlier on in one of the previous sessions about this small region in the Iberian Peninsula, which is in the northwest. And those of you that can see the PowerPoint, you'll see in the northwest there was a small region known as Sakhra. And I told you, in Arabic it was referred to as Sakhra to Balāṭ. And it was because the king at the time, his name was Balāṭ. And this was where Tariq ibn Ziyad and Musa ibn Zayd had conquered almost everything except this one small, tiny territory, and they were called back. Now from that kingdom, this King Balāṭ, during his time, what happens is he now dies. And he is succeeded by his son, I believe his name was Babun, or that's what they call him in Arabic. And what he does is he rules for about 2 years or so. And he manages to once again establish a bit more of his kingdom, just a bit more, nothing too much. There's a bit of some Christian conquests which take place and so on. But then he dies and doesn't leave an heir. And this is something, and he doesn't have any, like a direct child or anything. But then another person is appointed, referred to in Arabic as Adfinch, and we'll come back to this in a moment. Okay, but that's just something to tell us what was going on. Meanwhile, we have to kind of step away from there, come back to the mainland Iberian Peninsula, Al-Andalus, and we see the Qahtaniyin are still fighting with the Adnaniyin, who are all fighting with the Berber, whilst there are Fahriyin who are fighting against with the Qaysiyin, and all of this is going on. Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman, who is the Amir, he tries to crush and control whatever he can, but at the same time always giving preference to the Fihriyin. What happens at this one particular point, there is this one friend of his who gets killed. And Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman believes it was the doing of Bani Qais, a particular tribe. Now, this leads to some type of altercations which take place, some arguments and disputes between him and some of the rulers, some of Bani Qais, but it's kind of just left there. In the following weeks, what happens is Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman is presented with a case, like a particular case, some type of dispute, something nothing to do with the previous incidents, just something that takes place. But one of the people involved happens to be a Qaisi from Bani Qais. So what happens is Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman thinks this is a great opportunity to take some revenge from Bani Qais. So he has this person beaten. Now what happens is Bani Qais feel they've been oppressed, and they go to one of the popular rulers at the time, or not rulers but like leaders amongst them, like a chieftain amongst them, and a man by the name of Sumayl ibn Hatim. And this person emerges to play a key role in the chaos of Al-Andalus. Because what he does is he was a very charismatic leader, a very charismatic chief. And he starts to see their point and thinks, you're right, that this ruler, this Amir, seems to have this thing only for his tribe. So he starts to kind of incite the masses, especially the Qaysiyin, who were in huge numbers, by the way, against Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman. And he's quite successful. And then he starts to draw in certain other people, certain other rebellions that were taking place, and they start to rebel against the Caliph, against the Amir. And they're doing that. And the Amir, Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman, is trying to fight back. At the same time, he's trying to fight back with different kingdoms. And all this is taking place. Now, meanwhile, what happens is Sumayl ibn Hatim, at one point, what he'll do is he'll kind of incite certain people, certain governors. He's trying to make alliances with them and say, look, why don't we team up with you and we fight against Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman? And then some people are kind of agreeing with him and they're having some fights and some are unsuccessful. Then he's kind of making allegiances with other rebel groups and they're going against. But this person, he kind of travels certain parts of Andalusia, making allegiances at different times with different rebel groups, and actually holds a very strong fort, if you like, against the Amir, Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman, who, if I remind us at this time, he still continues with his extreme tribalism. What he seems to be doing is any people who he finds at fault, that are especially from the other tribes, he would have them whipped in the streets, would have them whipped very bad, and have certain like a mockery made out of them and so on. And at the same time, the Khawarij thing is going on. People are being declared kuffar, they're being declared kafirs. Many of the Berbers feel completely alienated. All this is going on. It is a time when Muslim historians had said things were so bad. The kingdom of Balāṭ, which I spoke of, which was then taken over by his son Babun, and then followed by Ed Finish, who we'll speak of slowly, speak of in a moment, that kingdom seemed to be growing from strength to strength, and they could see what was going on in the Muslim peninsula. They could see what was going on in Al-Andalus. Meanwhile, in the East, nobody cares about Al-Andalus because it's gone completely from the agenda, because they've got so many things on their own plate that Al-Andalus is in a complete different continent as far as they're concerned. So with that in mind, this is where Muslim historians had said truly the Iberian Peninsula was in need of a miracle. That's what it was in need of. The situation was so bad, the fitan and fasad. This is where we are reminded of that ritha, where the person says, with all this innocent bloodshed and poverty had risen drastically, starvation, that لِمِثْلِ هَذَا يَذُوبُ الْقَلْبُ مِنْ كَمَدٍ إِنْ كَانَ فِي الْقَلْبِ إِسْلَامٌ وَإِيمَانٌ. That it is due to things like this that the heart melts from anguish if it was to have in it an ounce or an atom even of Islam or Iman. The time in the entire, when we zoom out, of the entire Muslim world was looking so bad. Ya salam. Chaos in every corner. Bloodshed, corruption, tribalism, racism, fitan, fasad. Allahu Akbar. We are reminded of the words of a poet. There's an Urdu poet who went by the name Hali, and he speaks of his own time, but which is reminiscent of such a time, where he says, "E khase khasane rusul waqte dua hai, ummat pe teri aake ajab waqt pada hai." That he kind of addresses the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, saying, it is that this is such a strange, he says, this time is a time of dua, that indeed, like your ummah has been afflicted by a very shocking time and era. So with that in mind, this is where Muslim historians had said that Al-Andalus was completely gone, and Islam within the following few years would have perhaps disappeared, but also, if anything, we were in need for an absolute miracle. This is where we are also reminded that Allahu Akbar, that at times, perhaps miracles are exactly what we find. I'd like us to kind of once again zoom out from where we were and go to Baghdad. But we're going to fast forward. We're going to skip a few scenes. We are sitting in the court of a palace of Baghdad. Stability has now pretty much come throughout certain parts of the Muslim globe at this point. We're not saying how, but we're just saying it has been reasonably stabilized. There is the ruler Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, one of the Abbasid caliphs, a very popular one, somebody who has several famous encounters with the likes of Abu Hanifa and so on, and the stories are well known. But he's having a discussion with many of his wuzara, his wazirs, and he says to them, he says, "I'd like to ask you a question." He says, "Who is the falcon of Quraysh?" Falcon of Quraysh. And they say, trying to suck up to him in a way that, "Oh, it's you, of course." And he says, "Look, don't be stupid, right? You don't need to do that. Who is the falcon of Quraysh?" And then they say, was it Abu Bakr, was it Umar? And they go through these names. Was it Muawiyah? Was it Uthman? They mention all these great names, and he says no, no. And they say, well, you know, and then they go through some other names, and then eventually they say, well, we don't know. I mean, who was then the Falcon of Quraysh? And he says, it was Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah. And here there's a question mark. Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah, who's that? Stop. We've got to stop that scene from there. And we've got to reverse. We've got to rewind this. We've got to rewind history a little and go back in time. Back to what was taking place when the Caliphate of Bani Umayyah was crumbling. I mentioned that North Africa had kind of separated itself. It was under Khawarij rule, that Abdul Rahman ibn Habib was in charge of North Africa. I had mentioned that the Umayyads were being kind of murdered and so on, and everything was in a sense of decay and downfall. All of that is going on. There is bloodshed on almost every corner of the main cities of the Muslim Empire in the Middle East. That's what's going on. Umayyads are being hunted down. Now, during that time, there is a person by the name of Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah, ibn Hisham ibn Abdul Malik. Now, if you recall, I had said that Hisham ibn Abdul Malik was one of the last stable caliphs of the Umayyad kingdom, of the Umayyad dynasty. And once he died, everything kind of went pear-shaped. Now, this is the grandson of that great caliph. And he had many grandsons, and this is one of them. He's just a prince, if you like, or of many, amongst many Umayyad princes. And he's just living his normal life. He's chilling out. He was living in luxury until the Abbasids had ransacked Damascus. And he kind of moves out of what is, steps away from where the hype of things are. And he's in a quiet location. And one day he's trying to kind of, in fact it said that he's trying to calm his child down. He has a son. He's only 19 years old. And he's trying to make his child, who's an absolute baby at the time, and he's trying to make him stop crying. And so he's kind of carrying him and walking about, and he walks out of the house only to realize, wait a minute, he can see black flags have been raised on different corners of the streets. And this means, and the black flags represented the Abbasids. This meant that the Abbasids were here and the area was on lockdown. And Umayyads were being hunted. So he puts his child down, he goes inside, gives him to the mother, leaves the women folk. He has a younger brother by the name of Walid, who was approximately 13 years old at the time. He grabs him, he gets some money that he had, puts it together in a bag, and they run. And they begin to run. Whilst they are running, they are seen and spotted by some Abbasi soldiers. So now these Abbasids are on the chase. They're in pursuit. They're chasing Abdul Rahman and his brother Walid down these streets, and they're running after them. And they've got their swords in the air and everything. And these guys are running, and they reach the Euphrates River, the Al-Furat. And what they do is they throw themselves into the river. But the river is a mighty river, and it's got a strong type of current to it. And they're swimming against the current, and they're swimming, and they're kind of struggling. So the Abbasiyin that were chasing them, the soldiers, they didn't know how to swim, so they kind of stood there at the riverbank, and they said to these guys, they said, listen, come back. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it, said one of those. Said, so you know what? They said, come back, and you know what? As long as you're not fighting, you're cool. All we're going to do is take you in, but when, no harm shall befall you. So Abdul Rahman's younger brother Walid says, I'm going back. Abdul Rahman tells him, no, do not, don't listen to them. Keep on swimming. And he says, no, I'm going back. and he's not too far from the riverbank, and he climbs back on the riverbank. And they hold him and execute him brutally, right there, almost immediately. And Abdul Rahman witnesses that. He climbs out at the other end and he runs. He runs for his life. Abdul Rahman says that day, he says, I was so frightened that I ran and I ran. He says, I felt I was going to take flight at any moment, that I would actually take off into the air. That's how fast I ran. Allahu Akbar. And such situations make people experience such things. And what he does is he says, I headed westwards, but I headed towards North Africa. And why North Africa? Because Abdul Rahman, he was from, obviously, Bani Umayyah in term from his father's side, but his mother was actually a Berber. And the Berber tribes are mainly settled in North Africa, and he had several relatives and family which were kind of scattered in different parts of North Africa. So he heads towards North Africa, and he wants to go towards the capital, more or less of the time, which was like Ifriqiya or Qayrawan. But when he gets there, he begins to hear, and there's this whole story of how he cuts through the Hajjaj and how he goes through Egypt and parts of Libya, and then he gets to what would be modern day Tunisia, only to realize the status quo of North Africa. That Abdul Rahman ibn Habib, the Khariji, the Khawarij ruler, had kind of taken complete control. And he, because you have to remember, his struggle, the Khawarij struggle, was originally against who? It was against the Umayyads. In fact, theologically, right from the very beginning, it was against Muawiyah radiallahu an, and then secondarily against Ali radiallahu an as well. But so right from the very onset, the Khawarij have always hated Bani Umayyah. So when he comes to hear that, oh, Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah has set foot in my kingdom, he says, Allahu Akbar, get hold of him, hunt him down. And here is Muawiyah, this 19-year-old, Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah, who's now got multiple death warrants upon his head. So what he does is he heads back into what would be parts of Libya, a town called Barqa, and he goes into hiding. He has a few relatives there. He has along his journeys, he has a servant with him, who people say was a Greek servant by the name of Badr, a very loyal servant that remains with him throughout his journeys. Now, he lies low in Barqa. That's what he does, Abdul Rahman. He's totally disheveled. He's in a state of confusion. He doesn't know what to do. For several months, he just lies low. He's in distress. The Muslim world around him is collapsing. He himself is just fearful of his life. He doesn't know what's happened back in Damascus. Now, after months begin to pass, he thinks, well, what should I actually do? What should I be actually doing? Now, months start to look like years now passing by. So he thinks, look, either A, I can always remain in hiding and spend the rest of my life like this, or B, I become proactive and I do something. So what he starts to do is he starts to think, okay, if I'm to be proactive, where can I go? Because I can't stay in this town in Libya for the rest of my life. So he looks to the Muslim world, he looks to North Africa, and he thinks, nope, going there is suicide. he looks to the Middle East and he thinks, nope, going there is utter suicide. So during this time of thought, his attention is brought to Al-Andalus. People tell him that, do you know what's going on in Al-Andalus? Andalus has got its own chaos and confusion. In fact, there's so much, there's Berbers versus Arabs, and Arabs versus Arabs, and Fihriyin versus Qaysiyin, and Adnaniyin, and Qahtaniyin, and there's all this tribalism, and the Christian kingdoms in the north attacking further south, and they've declared independence from the entire Muslim world, and there's Khawarij type of insurgencies and rebellions taking place everywhere, and there's poverty, and there's all this. So he thinks that maybe that chaos may actually be conducive to my situation. So he doesn't just think, okay, what he does is he thinks, okay, who can I reach out to in Al-Andalus? Do I have any allies? So what he does is he sends his servant, he sends Badr, to be his eyes and ears in Andalus. So he does, he goes there and he comes back, and a lot of this going back and forth is taking place by Badr. Now Badr assesses the situation and they tell him, do you know who you have an ally in? You have an ally in the Berber. Because these people are a people who have no representation. So he reaches out to the Berber from where he is in Libya, sends his servant to negotiate, to write to certain Berbers and to communicate with them and say, look, listen, do you know that a prince of the Umayyad Dynasty is alive today and would like to come to Andalusia? Would he have your support? And they're like, hell yeah. They absolutely hate Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman, the Emir. They're like, we'll support him. But the thing is, the Berber are not in a position of power. So he's got a certain amount of support in terms of manpower, but he doesn't have power. Because these weren't people in positions of power. If you remember, the last governor had only put Arabs in positions of power. Not only any Arabs, certain tribes in positions of power. So then he decides to reach out to many of the Yemeni people. Now the Yemeni people, they did not used to get on with Bani Umayyah because they had that tribal difference, because they were not part of the Umayyin. The Bani Umayyah are from Quraysh and are from Mudar. Now a lot of the Yemeni tribes were not from Mudar. So they had this distance and they didn't like Bani Umayyah necessarily. But having said that, they didn't like the current ruler either. So Abdul Rahman plays on this and he says to them, look, listen, he says, what are you saying? Would you support me if I was to come there? He has this communicated to them. So many of them, they say, okay, fair enough, we'll do that. So now he has some allies within the Iberian Peninsula. What does he do next? Allahu Akbar. He prepares and he plans. So Allah says, وَأَعِدُّ and prepare. He reaches out he does research. Are there any other Umayyads remaining in the Muslim world? Scattered anyway. And he reaches out to them. And he finds dribs and drabs, and there's some Umayyi type of person, some far distant relative living in this place in Yemen and living in that place in Hajjaj and living in Egypt, one here. And he starts communicating to all of them. He writes letters. He announces his plans. He gains their support. They also agree that yes, if you do manage to go to Al-Andalus, we will come along and also support you. Now he seems to see some infrastructure almost being, at least theoretically, being mapped out. So what he does now, he thinks the time is right. 4 years have elapsed. Allahu Akbar. 4 years in his preparation had elapsed. It is now 138 Hijri. Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah alone travels through North Africa and crosses the sea into Al-Andalus. Just on his own. Carrying no real weapons, nothing, just his own sword, just which most people would carry, and his own garments and so on, but that's it. Just single-handedly lands in a place known as Al-Munyakar, which is in southern Spain. And there is actually a statue which has been erected in that place in remembrance of Abdul Rahman I. Now he lands there and he has a mass amount of support, because you have to remember, Hisham, his grandfather, was a legendary caliph of the entire Muslim world. One of the most powerful caliphs of the Umayyad Dynasty ever was Hisham. And this is his grandson who has come. And he hasn't just come. He's come with a claim to the dynasty. That this land was under the rule of my forefathers. And I have that right to rule it. He's come with that claim. The people around him, they support him. The Yemeni tribes arrive. The Berbers are there to support him. He then writes to Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman al-Fihri, the Amir at the time, who was an absolute oppressive and an absolute oppressor. He writes to him and says, look, this is who I am. I have come here. And he writes to him saying to rule as it was meant to be rightfully done. And he says to him, and I extend to you a hand of friendship. He says, if you will surrender to me, he says, I will make you in charge of certain things and give you a position of power. Obviously, Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman says to him that, have you lost looks at him as, has he lost the plot? Who is this person to come in my imara and tell me? So he says, okay. And Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman, what he does is he gets an army together and he says, despite all the rebellions going on, he says, let's head south, let's crush this Umayyad that has landed on this peninsula. Allahu Akbar. Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah gets the people around him and they advance north. And they are heading towards a place known as Al-Musara. Allahu Akbar. At this time, Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah is only 25 years of age. As they approach the battlefield and they know that this is where showdown will take place, the other armies are kind of descending and they can see them. He becomes aware that some of the Yemeni people around him are spreading rumors. They are saying that, oh, have you noticed this guy, Abdul Rahman, this young guy who's turned up, right? Have you noticed the horse that he has? Because many of them weren't well equipped. So they had like mules and they didn't even have decent horses. And they said, look at his horse. It's a rapid horse. Meaning it's like saying he's driving a sports car. It's like this guy's got a Porsche. What they were trying to get at is that if the battle steams up, he could easily leave us standing. I mean, he's not from here anyway. All he has to do is turn that horse around and he's off, nowhere to be seen. All we'll see is dust. So they start to spread these rumors that how can we actually be relying upon this guy when look at him and look at us. Now he becomes aware of these type of rumors. So what he does is he approaches one of the leaders of the Yemeni tribes, was a man by the name of Abu Subah Yahsubi. He approaches him and he actually, with wisdom, he says to Abu Subah, he says, hey, he says that You know, this horse I've got, he says it's too frisky and too swift and fast, and it doesn't let me become stable. He says, what do you say if I swap you for your mule? And that guy's like, what? Yeah, okay. That's like somebody saying, I'll swap my Porsche for that Volkswagen Passat. So this is what's going on. So this guy's, he's like, yeah, absolutely. So they swap. Now the Yemeni people, the tribesmen, they notice this and they see this guy riding a mule. I think, whoa, this does not seem like a person trying to run away from the battlefield. This seems like a person with determination. And that is exactly, Allahu Akbar, that is exactly what Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah had. He could see that this whole peninsula was engulfed by such darkness, by such corruption, that what he brought with him was a determination of light and hope. If this meant that Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah would meet his fate on the battlefield, then let it be so. But he would not turn back. Allahu Akbar. This craze, this obsession. Allah, I mean, when you see it in people, mountains can be moved. We are reminded of a poem which was actually used in, there's a poem which was actually used in the Indian independence quite a bit it's actually written by a person by the name of Bismil Azimabadi, but it's very popular. And he says, Sarfaroshi ki tamanna ab hamare dil mein hai, dekhna hai zor kitna bazue qatil mein. He says that this obsession now has kind of taken over our hearts. That now is the time to see how much strength the murderer actually has. There is an amazing line to it that he does say. He says that Haat jin mein ho junu katte nahi talwar se, सर जो उठ जाते हैं वो झुकते नहीं ललकार से. He says that the hands which once get a passion or an obsession within them, they are not simply cut by swords, meaning you cannot destroy a force by destroying people. He says heads which are finally raised, they don't just bow to anybody that summons them. This is the type of passion and determination that you see not only in people but especially in Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah. And this event, this battle that takes place at Al-Musara, Abdul Rahman displays immense courage, and success is what he is met with. He has a staggering success. And what they do is, in fact, and when he finishes, Allahu Akbar, and Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman kind of runs away with whatever is remaining of his army, Abu Sabah, the Yemeni leader, actually turns to many of the people with him and says, he kind of like, they make a plot that let's now kill Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah. But when he says that, many of the Yemeni people, the tribesmen and so on, they disagree with him. And they say, no, that this is a man of integrity. That did you see that this person has come here and he's given us a sense of hope. He's given us a direction. He's given us objectives. And what they do from there is they head to Qurtuba, which used to be the capital. And when Abdul Rahman heads there, and before he heads there, do you know, many of his army, they actually say that, oh, let's chase Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman's armies, and let's kill them, and let's kill him, and let's destroy them. And he actually stops them. And look at the wisdom. And he says to them that لا تتبعوهم, do not follow them. He says ولا تستأصلوا شأفة أعداء. He says, do not try to completely exterminate such a people. ترجون صداقتهم. He says, a people which you may be actually hopeful for their friendship. وَاسْتَبْقُوهُمْ لِأَشَدِّ عَدَاوَةٍ مِّنْهُمْ. He says, let them be, that they may help you against an enemy who is more vigorous and almost like determined against you and hateful against you. And he was referring to the kingdoms, the Christian kingdoms in the north that were kind of sweeping south gradually. He was referring to them. Now, with that in mind, what he says to the people around him is, let's head towards Qurtuba. And when they get to Qurtuba, he tells the people in Qurtuba, he sends in a letter and he says to them that, look, anybody, regardless of tribe, regardless of Bani Fihr or Bani Qais or Bani, he says, anybody who wishes to leave this town may do so with all his possessions. And he says, and anybody who decides to stay may do so. He says, I have come here, and he says, I have come here to rule as my grandfather ruled the Muslim world. Part of the Umayyad Dynasty and the Umayyad Khilafah. And he says, I've come here not to rob your wealth or kill your people. And he reassures them that none of that will take place. And they open the doors of Qurtuba to him. And when they do, that is exactly how he behaves. Now then what he begins to do is expand from town to city to province. And Allahu Akbar, he is met with great success. And he begins to stabilize. And amidst all of this, remember, there were at least 20 to 30 rebellions that were taking place. And Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah begins to extinguish them one after the other. And there was a person by the name of Ala ibn Mughith al-Hadrami who was in Seville. And this person, he had communicated with the Abbasiyin and Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, and he had said to him that, look, listen, would you want me to assassinate Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah? And he had said, absolutely, yes, and we'll give you so and such money and so on. So he gets such an army, Ala does, and he tries and he attacks Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah, but only to be met with utter failure. And Allah helps the armies and the army of Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah. And not only do they defeat Ala ibn Mughith's army, but what they do is they actually send a very kind of shocking message back to Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. What he sends back is actually the head of Ala ibn Mughith. And what is said is that Abu Ja'far al-Mansur had actually gone to Hajj. It was the days of Hajj, and it was just the days following after. So Hajj had been complete, and his camps were set up in a special place. So they had a very almost like a very type of low-key secret operation in which a person went and leaves the head of Ala ibn Mughith unnoticed right outside the tent of Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. And when he comes outside, he kind of sees this box and he opens it and he finds the head of Ala, and he finds with it a message from Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah. And it is transmitted that he says that قَدْ عَرَّضْنَا هَذَا الْفَتَى. He says that we, this Ala ibn Mughith, we had kind of encouraged him and to kind of do this. And then he's shocked by the whole incident, and he says that this is only the doing of only a shaitan. And when some of the people kind of look to him, meaning, shall we kind of try to deal with Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah? And he says, مَا لَنَا فِي هَذَا الْفَتَى مِن مَطْمَعٍ. He says, we don't want anything to do with this young man, this young guy. And he says, Alhamdulillah alladhi ja'ala baynana wa bayna al-bahr. He says, Allah be praised who placed a sea between him and us. Meaning, let him be. We've got our own worries to worry about. Now, that is the story of how Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah enters Al-Andalus. And we will in the following session see what he goes on to establish and how he kind of cements stability into the Iberian Peninsula. We will see how what his kingdom goes on to set the trajectory for a Khilafah to be set up in Al-Andalus. But that's to come. But what I'd like us to do for the moment is once again stop where we are. And we're going to fast forward back to that scene where we were, where Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, many months later, perhaps even years later, is sitting in his palace and he asks the people, who is the falcon of Quraysh? And they said, who? And then he responds with Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah. They ask him why. And he says, Kharaja bi nafsi. He's somebody, Kharaja, he says, he's somebody who just went out on his own. He says, bi mufradihi, just completely, entirely on his own from Damascus. He says, mustashiban li ra'yi. He says, only accompanying his opinions, wa mu'ayyidan bi azmi, and only supported by his determination. He said, ya'burul qafar, he crossed a desert. وَيَرْكَبُ الْبَحْرِ, and he traversed a sea. حَتَّى يَدْخُلَ بَلَدًا أَعْجَمِيًّا. He says, until he entered a non-Arab land, the Iberian Peninsula. He says, فَجَنَّدَ الْأَجْنَادِ, then he set up armies. وَمَصَّرَ الْأَمْصَارِ, and he erected cities. He says, وَأَقَامَ مُلْكًا بَعْدَ انْقِطَائِهِ, and he re-established a dynasty, the Umayyad Dynasty, after it had disappeared from the face of the earth. لِحُسْنِ تَدْبِيرِ, only by his good planning. وَلِشِدَّةِ عَزْمِ, and only due to his determined passion. They say that when Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah, he entered the Iberian Peninsula, he came single-handed, he stepped off that boat. And the day he died, he had beneath him an army 100,000 strong. وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامِ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ, and those days, Allah says, we will rotate amongst the people. With that in mind, we've arrived at the end of really today's session, and to look into what comes after Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah has actually had a stronghold in the Iberian Peninsula and the events which follow. For that, inshallah, I'll see you all next session. Jazakumullah al-khair for listening attentively. Do remember me in your humble du'as. Once again, Jazakumullah al-khair for listening. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.